All right. This is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 21, East Asia in Global Perspective, looking at Section 1, East Asia and Europe. So East Asia, typically what we mean by East Asia, is China, but also Japan and Korea to a certain extent. So that is geographically where we're looking at. We're going to focus a little bit more on China, just due to China's size and influence in the region. Two political dynasties existed in China between the years 1500 and 1750, which is kind of the year of focus here. The Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty. While there were many similarities between the two dynasties, the biggest difference between the two is that the Ming Dynasty was a Chinese dynasty, ethnically Chinese, whereas the Qing Dynasty was a dynasty of outsiders, and that was Manchus from Manchuria, which is northern China. So at least during the Qing Dynasty here, this was a minority Manchu population ruling over a Chinese population, ethnically Chinese. Although, ethnically there was a difference, it should also be mentioned that the Qing Dynasty adopted Chinese culture. So it wasn't completely foreign, but certainly that is the big difference between the Ming and the Qing, right? Chinese as compared to Manchurian. So in regards to East Asia's contact with Europe, perhaps one of the most significant changes, especially after 1492, was the introduction to American silver. We might say that American silver poured into East Asia, right? It poured into East Asia, simply, the abundance of all that silver coming from the New World, coming from the Spanish, and as silver poured into East Asia, goods poured out. Typically, the Spanish brought in silver, but silver could be brought by other European powers, and the Chinese exported goods and took silver in exchange. The Chinese interacted with pretty much all European countries and trading companies in East Asia. First of all, in regards to Portugal, this is more or less going to be true of all the European countries, but Portugal was limited in what and where they could trade. For the most part, China, we might just say this in general, China limited European trade, right, to a large degree. The Portuguese, however, were given the port of Macau. So this was a Chinese port where Portugal was allowed to trade. So not everywhere in China could these nations freely trade, but specific trading cities, Macau probably the most famous one, at least in the case of Portugal, where they were able to do business there. As far as Spain went, the Spanish really gained access to China through Manila. Manila was the what we might call the capital and trading center in the Philippines. So this actually wasn't in China, but it served as a base for the Spanish to really take silver from. And if we, draw just kind of a crude map here, this will be actually, I don't know where. This will be the Americas, South America. So if we think of this as being China right here, this as being the Philippines, And there are a bunch of other, little islands kind of down here by the Philippines. And this being the Americas, specifically Mexico right here. For the Spanish, really what it was silver coming out of Mexico, arriving in the Philippines, and then those trade commodities being brought into China, and then those commodities being brought back, right? So this sort of Pacific Ocean trade was very significant. A lot of silver coming out of the New World, going to the Philippines, and then making its way to China via Spain. The island of Taiwan was controlled by, we might say, Spanish and Dutch controlled until the Qing dynasty. And the Qing, if we go back up here, Qing, Qing. If we go back up here, the Qing dynasty took control in 1644. So, sometime after that point, the Qing dynasty had taken Taiwan over and expelled the Spanish and the Dutch both from that area. However, probably the strongest European power trading in East Asia at the time was the Dutch via the Dutch East India Company. The VOC is just the abbreviation for this company. Again, this was a company that was granted a monopoly. This was one of the most powerful and wealthiest corporations. Joint stock company is what it was, but this was the most powerful and wealthy businesses to have ever existed. The Dutch East India Company took control of the very important trading city of Malacca. The Straits of Malacca connect East Asia to India. So anything that traveled by ship from East Asia, from either Japan, Korea, or China, if that were to get to India or Africa or really anywhere else, most of those goods passed through the Straits of Malacca. This was initially controlled by Portugal, but Portugal lost control of it. And because of that, the Dutch were able to really extract a lot of wealth from controlling this very important strategic area globally. So it was kind of like the gateway between East Asia and India and the rest there. However, as powerful as the Dutch East India Company was, all of these nations, Spain, Portugal, the Dutch, they were really only establishing trading posts and had a lot of control on the ocean. But when it came to the actual land, that's where dynasties like the Ming and the Qing empires still, flex their muscles, so to speak. Evidence of this is the Dutch performing the kowtow for Qing rulers. The kowtow is a ritual greeting, you might say. It involves, on the one hand, you might have the Chinese emperor, will draw a crown on him. The kowtow involves, getting down on your knees and touching your head to the ground. It's a sign of deference. Pretty much the Chinese emperors required everybody to perform the kowtow in front of him. And that was a way of showing that the Chinese, the Ming or the Qing dynasty, were in the superior position. So the Dutch performed this ritual greeting as well. Along with the economic connections also came religious connections. Jesuits, remember this is, if we don't recall, Jesuits belong to the Society of Jesus. And really what they seek is converts, so that is to convert people to Christianity. We saw Jesuits in the New World especially, but they were also in China looking for potential Chinese converts. The Jesuits took a very interesting strategy in China, and that was to target the intellectual and political elite. In other words, to ignore the common class, which when you look at Christianity as a religion, it's never really been, it becomes, but it's never really been about a religion of the elite. Christianity, at least in its origins, has always thrived amongst the common population. So this effort to try and sway the intellectual elite, we might call this a top-down approach, was successful in a limited way. It really didn't work out in the long run. Perhaps, part of it has to do with the Jesuit strategy of trying to do a top-down approach. Another part of it has to do with the way that Christian belief mixes with Chinese belief systems and Chinese philosophies. But in the long run, the Christian influence in China remains somewhat limited. Matteo Ricci, he was a Jesuit who specialized in Chinese culture. So a lot of Christian works. He brought over a lot of Christian works, learned the Chinese language, learned Chinese culture, and really served as kind of a cultural gateway, you might say, between these two worlds, Europe and East Asia. The Qing Emperor Kangxi did warm up to ideas regarding Christianity. Kangxi is a Qing emperor. He, at the very least, entertained some of the Jesuit ideas. What the Jesuits did and what they were effective in doing, and this also affected the intellectual and political elite, was to show off European technology. Astronomy, for example, was one. You might put knowledge in here as well. So, European technology, European knowledge, European science, Jesuits kind of use these as an in to spread the Christian faith. Little sort of mechanical trinkets, for example, the Europeans would bring over, and that would impress a lot of the Chinese elites. And that was kind of a way to get the foot in the door, so to speak, and then to spread the message of Christianity that way. Kangxi was a Qing emperor who you might say warmed up to Christianity, or even just European ideas. This was especially true because Western medicine helped to cure some of Kangxi's illnesses, and so his kind of impressed by the medicine that Europeans brought, he was a little bit more willing to listen. But it was still difficult for Jesuits. So in order for Christianity to effectively at least spread in Chinese culture among the elite, the emperor, whoever it was, the missionaries had to allow for some flexibility. A good example of this is Confucian, which was the primary philosophy. So we might say Confucian is an Eastern philosophy. We'll talk more about it in another chapter. But one of the tenets of Confucianism was ancestor worship. That is to honor one's ancestors. And really in Christianity, there wasn't a lot of room for ancestor worship. But what the Jesuits did was they allowed for people to continue worshiping their ancestors while adopting Christianity. This obviously was a huge conflict for the Christians back in Rome, especially for the Pope, who disagreed and said that Christianity needed to be taught in a very rigid way, kind of in the same way that Christianity was imposed on people in the New World, how it was imposed on people with Europe. Not really a lot of wiggle room for people to, really practice it in their own way. And so this blending of Confucianism and Christianity and ancestor worship, while it was, effective in China, it didn't get the green light by the Pope and by other religious authorities. As a result, Kangxi and other Chinese eventually expelled the Jesuits in 1690, specifically those that would not. We might say the Jesuits were expelled in 1690 that kept rigid ideology. And after that, while you did have some kind of footprint of Christianity in China, it never really flourished in the same way that it flourished in different parts of the world. So Europeans had an influence on China, certainly, whether that was bringing European technology and science, European medicine, bringing ideas regarding Christianity, European trade. But China also did influence Europe. Chinese knowledge about vaccines eventually made their way to Europe. In terms of art, the practice of wallpaper, which was used in China, was eventually adopted in Europe, and especially the Confucian idea of a benevolent ruler. We'll talk again more about Confucianism, but one of the tenets of Confucian philosophy is that rulers ought to be benevolent. They ought to treat their people fairly. They shouldn't be dictators. This was what some Enlightenment thinkers called the philosopher king. The idea that the perfect ruling system is kind of this all-knowing, benevolent ruler, and that was in part inspired by Chinese ideas about how a king should rule. Here you can see a Chinese map, which goes to show the extent to which knowledge from around the world was brought to the Chinese and how the Chinese embrace certain aspects of it. This is a globe right here. It's turned sideways, but if you can kind of make it out, this looks like South America right here, North America in this region. Again, it's sideways. That kind of looks like a continent there. And then you can start to see the, the Asian coast, or what makes up Asia right there anyways. In addition to Chinese interactions was Japan, and Japan is a place that we'll continue to talk about to a certain degree here. In Japan, rather than one single dynasty that ruled everyone, rather than a centralized state, instead Japan was mostly characterized by local daimyo. Daimyo were local rulers. We might call them lords. They owned the land. Much like feudal Europe, Japan for a very long time, at least until 1600, Japan was characterized by these various daimyo that controlled locally built castles, had very much a feudal system like medieval Europe. Jesuits also entered into Japan. Much like in China, they were also met with resistance. While there were some daimyo that embraced Jesuits and brought Jesuits in, for the most part, Jesuits had limited success. Nagasaki was one area where European influence was greater than anywhere else. One of the daimyo there in Nagasaki. Nagasaki is a harbor, probably should say this, a harbor city. So it's a city with access to the ocean. And so some of the daimyo there allowed for Jesuits and the spread of Christianity there in Nagasaki. There were other daimyo that adopted Christianity, anywhere between 100,000 and 300,000 Christians in Japan. However, beginning in the 1600s, Japan began issuing a number of seclusion decrees, and this was to isolate Japan. In a sense, Jesuits were seen as a threat. They were seen as overthrowing the older system, and there was a slow but steady process to rid Japan of its Jesuit and European influence. The decree of 1614 essentially was a ban on Christianity, saying that Christianity was essentially treason. It was involved in plots to overthrow the government. Christians were persecuted in Japan, anything from death to exile to forced conversions back. And Europeans in general were limited in terms of trade and immigration. So we might say Europeans limited. It was illegal for Europeans to trade in Japan, illegal for Europeans to immigrate in Japan unless they followed specific rules and specific protocols. There was one exception, the Dutch. The Dutch were given greater access to Japan. They were allowed to trade in Nagasaki Harbor. Nagasaki Harbor was the only place Dutch, really, and others permitted to trade. And again, this was to kind of keep control on the Dutch, to keep a handle on it, to make sure there was nothing threatening in nature that was entering in Japan. But also, one of the reasons why Japan continued to trade with outsiders was, to keep tabs on the outside world. Dutch studies outside information and knowledge. For as much as the Japanese wanted to limit the amount of influence and limit the amount of outside contact, it was also very crucial for Japan to understand what was going on in the world around them. And so part of the trade-off in allowing the Dutch to trade in Nagasaki was that the Japanese could continue to gain information about the outside world.